Ahoy hoy fellow bookworms, my name is Caroline and I like to read books, so let's talk about them. Today's video is going to be a review of Godsgrave by Kristoff, which is the sequel to Nevernight and the second book in what I think is going to be a trilogy. I am going to be keeping this video spoiler free for Godsgrave, but if you haven't read Nevernight yet, this video will contain spoilers for that, so I will leave the link to my spoiler free Nevernight review in case you want to check that one out instead. I did enjoy Nevernight, but definitely not as much as everyone else. Those first like 100 or so pages were really fucking hard for me to get through. I didn't particularly like the writing style. There were metaphors that didn't make sense. I didn't like the footnotes all that much either. It wasn't really until Mia got to assassin school that I started to really get into things. And by the end of the book, I was completely hooked and I ended up really looking forward to Godsgrave. I actually went to the launch of it here in Sydney. I got my book signed by Kristoff and he was absolutely lovely. So Godsgrave actually ended up being much better than Nevernight for me and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. There isn't much that I want to say about the plot of Godsgrave, but basically it picks up a couple of months after Nevernight finishes. Mia is a fully fledged blade out doing assassin stuff and killing people, and she has this dangerous encounter with an old enemy and discovers some very interesting information. She's presented with an opportunity to get revenge on the two people who are at the very top of her hit list for what they did to her family, but in order to get this revenge she has to go undercover in like a gladiatorial competition and win it, and that's kind of where the plot goes. As always, I'm going to start with the pros and then move on to the cons. The first pro that I want to mention is that Godsgrave got straight to the action. Nevernight was really slow to start and that ended up being one of the main reasons for my lower rating, but Godsgrave just gets straight into the fun stuff. I enjoyed that there was no slow like reintroduction to the world because I think that would have bogged down an assassin story. Instead, it begins and we just get Mia being an assassin straight away. It's fun, it's exciting, and it's just straight into the action, and honestly I think the pacing overall in this book was really well done. Pro number 2 is Mia the bisexual badass. I quite like Mia as a character. She's strong, she's flawed, and she's super fucking rude, but I actually love her. Her growth from book 1 to here is impressive, and I think what makes her amazing is that she isn't perfect. Mia is reckless, impulsive, quick to anger, and arrogant, but those flaws are what make her real and surprisingly likable. I can't comment on how good and accurate the bisexual representation in this book was because personally I'm not bisexual, but I do want to say that it was awesome to see a bisexual main character in a fantasy book because that is not something we like ever fucking see, so I was really excited to read about that. And there's also a bit of a female-female romance in here, so that was super awesome and adorable as well, and I loved it so much. Third pro I want to mention is all the new side characters. For some reason, whenever I read a fantasy book, the main character is never my favorite character. I always much prefer the side characters because I find them like so interesting and funny and just lovable. This book was no exception. We're introduced to a whole bunch of new side characters and I just loved them all so much. They come from all different parts of the world and have these really interesting backstories that we learn like little bits and pieces of, but I wanted to learn so much more about them. So I'm hoping we'll learn more about them in the next book, hopefully, but who fucking knows. But I just found them so lovable. There were so many moments where they would be like sitting at dinner and one of them would share a little anecdote about their past and I would just be like, aw, my baby. Like I really cared about them so quickly because for some reason side characters just have a special place in my heart. So when this like whole new crew of side characters were introduced in this book, it made me really happy and I really liked them, even though, you know, it's a Kristoff book, so not all of them survived, but that's fine. On to the cons now. I only have 2 that I want to mention. The first of those being the footnotes. I mentioned this earlier in the video, but when I read Nevernight, I just didn't enjoy the footnotes like at all. I thought the world building that was in them was interesting, but they kind of interrupted the flow of the story and the content of those should have been like seamlessly integrated into the story instead. I know that this is probably not an opinion shared by other people, but it's just the way I felt and I had the same problem with Godsgrave as well. A lot of the time what was in the footnote would be kind of interesting, but for a lot of them I just didn't particularly care what was in them. And I did mention this once on Instagram and I got some snarky comment from someone saying like, you don't have to read the footnotes, they're not essential reading. And I was like, yeah, but what if they are? There could be something really essential mentioned in the footnotes that I just skim over or don't even read, and then I'm going to be confused in book 3 when it becomes essential. So like, I have to read the footnotes, but like, I don't have to enjoy them. I probably sounded really rude when I said that, but footnotes just aren't my thing. I will say that when I went to the Godsgrave launch here in Sydney, Jay was asked a few questions and one of them was about the footnotes and his explanation was actually really good. He talked about how when he was younger he would read like the really dense epic fantasy paperbacks where there would be like an entire chapter dedicated to like the political system or the type of coin they used and stuff like that. And he really enjoyed the little tidbits that you could take out of that, but didn't want to dedicate like huge sections of his book to talking about them, which I completely understood. So he said he decided to put them in footnotes so that you could get those little bits of information without completely slowing the story down. And I thought that was really interesting, but I kind of think personally that footnotes have the opposite effect, where when I'm reading and I get to the little asterisk that says there's a footnote, it slows me down because I'll go read the footnote and then come back. So I kind of think that footnotes slow down the flow of the story, but that's just my personal opinion. The second and final con that I want to mention is the predictability of this story. Although I thoroughly enjoyed Godsgrave, like I had a lot of fun reading this book, it is quite predictable from the point Mia goes undercover until the end, because there's really only like one direction that the story can go in. There were a couple of detours along the way, but we always ended up on that same path heading for that same conclusion, so it just really wasn't that surprising for me. This definitely didn't ruin my enjoyment because it is still a genuinely entertaining book and a lot of people are going to like it, but I just thought it was worth mentioning. I should mention as well that yes, things were quite predictable for the most part, but there were still a few surprises along the way for me. There was one like around the middle that completely surprised me, and then at the end there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens, and probably like 2 out of many things there surprised me a lot. So it was still surprising and enjoyable, but I think overall the plot was kind of predictable. That brings us to the end of this review though, guys. Godsgrave gets a solid 4 out of 5 stars from me because it was entertaining and fast-paced and really fun to read. So be sure to let me know your thoughts on this book down in the comments. I upload videos Wednesdays, Saturdays, and sometimes Mondays as well, so be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in my next video. Toodaloo!